Welcome to Liturgy of Whispers. Before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Leave in the comments where you are watching from right now, and tell me the exact time on your clock as you listen to these words. Because what I am about to share with you is the kind of story that makes you want to know you are not alone. The kind of story that makes you glance toward the nearest window, toward the nearest door, and wonder, just for a moment, whether the darkness outside is truly empty. It is January 1928. The state of Michigan sits under a sky so heavy with cold that the air itself seems to crack when you breathe it. The Great Lakes region has endured brutal winters before, winters that killed livestock, winters that buried farmhouses to their rooftops, winters that turned rivers into stone. But the winter of 1928 is different. The old men sitting by their wood stoves in the small towns surrounding Blackmir Lake will later say that this winter felt deliberate, purposeful, as though the cold had arrived not merely as a season, but as a warning. Blackmir Lake stretches across 11 miles of the northern Michigan wilderness, cradled between dense pine forests and limestone ridges that have stood since before any European foot touched this land. The Ojibwe people who once fished these waters had a name for the lake that roughly translates, in the most careful interpretation, to the place that breathes beneath. Missionaries and settlers who arrived in the mid-1800s dismissed this name as folklore. They renamed the lake after a surveyor named Gerald Blackmir, a man who, historical records note, refused to ever set foot on the frozen surface himself. No one at the time thought to ask him why. By 1928, Blackmir Lake has become a quiet destination for ice fishermen from the surrounding counties. Every January, small clusters of men drag their wooden shanties out onto the surface, drill their holes through ice that can reach 18 inches thick by mid-month, and settle in for hours of patient, meditative waiting. It is a tradition, a ritual, a way for working men, farmers, mill workers, railroad laborers, to claim something slow and quiet from lives that offered very little of either. On the morning of January the 14th, 5 men drive out onto the ice in 2 separate trucks. Their names are recorded in the Alcona County Sheriff's report filed 3 days later. Earl Duchamp, age 44, a sawmill foreman. His younger brother, Raymond Duchamp, age 38. Theodore Voss, age 51, a dairy farmer from the eastern edge of the county. Carl Hennessy, age 30, a railroad worker who had moved to the region only 2 years prior from Ohio. And the 5th man, the one whose testimony would become the center of everything, was a 62-year-old retired schoolteacher named August Marin. August Marin is important. Remember that name. The 5 men set up their equipment approximately 400 yards from the northern shoreline, in a section of the lake they had fished together for the past 6 seasons. The ice that morning was solid. Earl Duchamp later testified that he had drilled a test bore near the shore before they drove out, and the ice measured a full 19 inches. Conditions were calm. The temperature sat at approximately 14 degrees Fahrenheit. A light wind moved from the northwest, carrying fine crystals of surface snow across the ice in slow, ghostly curtains. By 10 in the morning, they had their holes drilled and their lines in the water. For the first 2 hours, nothing unusual occurred. Theodore Voss caught 2 perch in quick succession. Raymond Duchamp complained about the cold seeping through his boots. Carl Hennessy, the youngest and most restless of the group, walked several times in wide circles around their setup, partly for warmth and partly, he later admitted, because something about sitting still on that particular section of the lake made him uneasy in a way he could not articulate. When the sheriff's deputy later asked him to try to describe the feeling, Hennessy paused for a long moment before saying, "It felt like the ice was listening." No one laughed when he said this. August Marin, the retired schoolteacher, had set himself slightly apart from the others, as was apparently his habit. He was a meticulous man, according to those who knew him, a keeper of detailed personal journals, a reader of scientific periodicals, a man who had spent 40 years teaching young minds to observe the world carefully and record what they saw without embellishment. His wife, Edna Marin, told investigators that her husband was the least superstitious man she had ever known. He did not believe in ghosts. He did not believe in signs or omens. He believed in evidence. What August Marin saw at 12:17 in the afternoon on January 14, 1928, he recorded in his journal that same evening in careful, measured handwriting. The journal still exists. It is held in a private collection, but its contents were transcribed in a 1962 regional history pamphlet published by the Alcona County Historical Society. The transcription reads exactly as follows. The water beneath my hole changed color, not gradually, instantaneously. From the dark clarity it had held all morning to something that I can only describe as a darkness that had texture, as though the water had thickened without becoming ice. I pulled my line up instinctively, and then the surface of the water in my hole bulged upward in the way that water bulges when something large directly beneath it displaces pressure. I stood. I looked at the other holes. They were doing the same. All 4 of them. Simultaneously. And then the ice beneath my feet produced a sound I have heard only once before in my life. A long, low, resonant tone, like a note struck on the lowest string of an instrument so large I cannot conceive of its size. And something rose.
August Marin was not a man given to panic. This is perhaps the most significant detail in everything that follows. Because when we examined the events of January 14, 1928, through the lens of the men who experienced them, we find a spectrum of reactions that tells us something profound about the nature of what they witnessed. Carl Hennessy ran. Raymond Duchamp dropped to his knees on the ice and covered his eyes with both hands. Theodore Voss stood completely still, his fishing rod still gripped in his right hand, the line still trailing into a hole that was no longer behaving like a hole in ice above water, but like something else entirely, like an opening into a place that had no name in any language spoken by anyone standing on that frozen surface. Earl Duchamp later said he could not move. Not from fear, he insisted repeatedly, but because his legs simply stopped receiving instructions from his brain. He described it as a temporary severance, a disconnection. But August Marin stood up, adjusted his footing on the ice, and watched. He watched for what he estimated to be between 40 and 60 seconds, though he acknowledged in his journal that time had become unreliable in that moment. He watched with the same focused, deliberate attention he had trained himself to apply to everything worth understanding. And what he saw, he recorded. Not immediately, not while standing on the ice, because his hands were shaking too severely for writing by the time it was over. But that evening, sitting at the kitchen table in his home in the town of Harrisville, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and his wife Edna sitting quietly across the room, having already learned in 41 years of marriage when her husband needed silence more than comfort. What rose from beneath the ice of Blackmir Lake on that January morning was not, according to August Marin's careful testimony, a creature in any sense that the word creature typically implies. He was explicit about this. He used the word creature once in his account, and then crossed it out and wrote beside it, insufficient. What rose was, in his description, a displacement, a presence defined not by what it was, but by what it did to everything around it. The water in all 5 fishing holes did not merely bulge, it inverted. Marin described the surface of the water curving upward at the edges and collapsing inward at the center, as though gravity in that precise location had negotiated a different arrangement with the mass beneath. The ice, he wrote, did not crack. It flexed, like a membrane, like something that was not quite as solid as they had all assumed. The sound came first, that low, resonant tone he had described, the impossible note from an impossible instrument. Then the light. This is the detail that the 1962 historical pamphlet handled most cautiously, noting in an editorial aside that Marin's account becomes, at this juncture, most difficult to assess through a conventional scientific framework. Because August Marin, retired schoolteacher, meticulous journal keeper, self-described non-believer in anything that could not be weighed and measured, wrote that there was light coming from beneath the ice, not from beneath the water,
from beneath the ice itself, as though the ice were not frozen water sitting above a lake bed, but a thin, translucent ceiling above something that had its own illumination. The light was not a single color. It shifted. Marin spent nearly a full paragraph attempting to describe the color sequence, and ultimately concluded only that none of the colors had names he could locate in any language he spoke. Carl Hennessy had by this point reached the edge of the ice nearest the northern shore, and was no longer watching. Raymond Duchamp, still on his knees, was praying. Theodore Voss had not moved. Later, when investigators pressed him for detail, Voss gave the shortest account of any of the 5 men. He said, "I saw it. I will not describe it. I have a family. Some things you do not put into words because words make them real in a way that is permanent, and I will not carry that permanence." The investigating deputy, a practical man named Howard Stills, who had worked rural Michigan law enforcement for 22 years, wrote in his report that Voss appeared during questioning to be a man who had made a firm and irrevocable decision, not to deny what he had seen, but to contain it. To keep it behind a wall he had built in the days between the event and the interview, and to maintain that wall for whatever remained of his life. Theodore Voss died in 1951. His family says he never spoke of Blackmir Lake again. Earl Duchamp's account occupies the most pages in the sheriff's file, partly because he was interviewed 3 separate times, once the day after the incident, once a week later, and once more in March of 1928 when a regional newspaper began asking questions, and the sheriff's office felt the need to formalize its documentation. Across all 3 interviews, Earl Duchamp's account remained almost perfectly consistent, which the deputy noted was itself unusual. Most witnesses, he wrote, shift their recollections over time. They add details that memory supplies, or they subtract details that daylight makes uncomfortable. Earl Duchamp did neither. He said the same things in the same order, with the same pauses in the same places, as though he were not remembering, but reciting. As though the experience had been engraved in him rather than stored. What Earl Duchamp described, in his own plain and undecorated language, was a shape beneath the ice that was too large to have been living in Blackmir Lake without anyone knowing. He said it was not swimming. He said it was not floating. He said it was ascending in the way that something ascends when it has decided to ascend. Not propelled by muscle or current, but by intention. By will. It rose slowly, he said. And as it rose, it grew larger. Not because it was getting closer, though it was, but because it was expanding, as though the act of rising was the act of becoming. And then, after somewhere between 40 and 60 seconds by August Marin's careful estimation, it stopped. The light faded. The tone dissolved into silence. The water in the 5 fishing holes dropped back to its natural level, and resumed its ordinary, dark, cold stillness. The ice beneath them stopped flexing and was simply ice again. 19 inches of frozen water above a lake that now showed no evidence whatsoever that anything had happened. August Marin stood on the ice for another full minute before he moved. Then he walked to where Raymond Duchamp was still kneeling, helped him to his feet, and said, according to Raymond's own account given to the deputy with quiet certainty, he said, "We need to write this down before we talk to each other. We need to write it down separately, so that we know what we each actually saw." Only Marin and Earl Duchamp followed this instruction. The others could not bring themselves to write it. Not then. Not ever.
The sheriff's report, filed on January 17, 1928, is a document that manages to be simultaneously thorough and evasive. Deputy Howard Stills was, by all available accounts, a competent and conscientious officer. He had handled drownings, hunting accidents, domestic disputes, and the occasional violent crime with equal measures of efficiency and discretion. He was not a man who embellished. He was not a man who dramatized. The people of Alcona County trusted him precisely because he dealt in facts the way a carpenter deals in measurements, not as approximations, not as estimates, but as fixed and dependable truths upon which decisions could be safely built. When Howard Stills told you something, you believed him, not because he was charming or persuasive, but because he had never given anyone a reason not to. Which is why the language in his January 17th report is so remarkable. The report begins in the standard format of the era: date, location, names of individuals interviewed, brief summary of the complaint or incident that prompted the investigation. It notes that 5 men reported an unusual occurrence on the surface of Blackmir Lake on the morning of January 14th. It notes that all 5 men were interviewed separately. It notes that their accounts, while varying in certain specific details, were consistent in their broad outlines. And then, where a standard report of this kind would proceed to a summary assessment, probable explanation, recommended action, case status,
Deputy Stills wrote something that his supervisor, Sheriff Leonard Abbots, later said he had never seen written in an official county document before or since. He wrote, "I am not able to offer a probable explanation at this time, as no probable explanation presents itself." That sentence sat in the Alcona County Sheriff's file for 34 years before the Historical Society found it. Sheriff Abbots, when asked about the report in a 1955 interview given to a local newspaper on the occasion of his retirement, chose his words with the same careful deliberation that Stills had apparently applied to the report itself. He said that Stills had been a reliable deputy for many years, and that he had no reason to doubt the sincerity of the report. When pressed on what he personally believed had happened on Blackmir Lake, Abbots was quiet for a moment, and then said, "I believe 5 men saw something they couldn't account for. I believe Howard Stills couldn't account for it either. I believe some things happen in this world that do not wait for our permission before happening, and I believe the honest thing to do when you encounter one of those things is to say so plainly, rather than invent a comfortable story to replace it." He then declined to say anything further on the subject. The local newspaper that covered the story initially, the Harrisville Courier, a small weekly publication that served the northern counties, ran a brief item in its January 19th edition. The item was 4 paragraphs long and was placed on page 3, below an advertisement for a hardware supplier, and beside a brief notice about an upcoming church social. The headline read, "Local men report strange occurrence on Blackmir Lake." The tone of the piece was carefully neutral, which likely reflected the editor's uncertainty about how seriously to treat the account, balanced against his awareness that 2 of the 5 men, Earl Duchamp and August Marin, were well-regarded members of the community whose word was not lightly dismissed. The item generated 17 letters to the editor over the following 3 weeks. 12 of those letters expressed skepticism ranging from gentle to contemptuous. 3 expressed serious interest and requested more information. One letter, from a woman who identified herself only as a longtime resident of the Northern Shore, said that she was not surprised, that she had heard things from beneath the ice on winter nights for as long as she could remember, and that she had stopped walking on the lake alone after an evening in February of 1919, when the ice beneath her had produced that same low tone that Earl Duchamp described in his interview. She said she had told no one for 9 years because she had no desire to be considered unstable. She signed her letter with initials only, M.R. The 17th letter came from a man named Dr. Cornelius Haight, a professor of geology at the University of Michigan, who had spent several summers conducting surveys of the northern Michigan lake systems. His letter was the longest of the 17 and the most technically precise. He offered 3 possible natural explanations for what the men had described. The first was seismic activity, minor subterranean movement that could cause ice to flex and produce low-frequency sound. The second was methane release from decomposing organic matter on the lakebed, which could cause water displacement, and in certain conditions produce visual distortions beneath the surface. The third was a phenomenon he called thermal inversion cascading, in which dramatic temperature differentials between water layers could, under specific conditions, create optical effects that a layperson might describe as light emanating from beneath the ice. Dr. Haight's letter was thoughtful and well-reasoned. It was also, as August Marin oriented a private letter to a colleague written in February of 1928, entirely insufficient. Marin wrote, "I have read the professor's explanations with genuine attention and genuine respect for the rigor behind them. I do not dismiss them. But I was standing on that ice. I am a man who has spent 4 decades teaching children the difference between what they imagine and what they observe. I know the difference. What I observed on January 14th was not a thermal inversion. It was not methane. It was not seismic activity. It was something that rose with purpose. Something that paused, as things pause when they are making a decision. And something that descended again, not because it was finished, but because it chose to be. I cannot prove this. I am aware that I cannot prove this. But I have spent my entire adult life insisting on honesty above comfort, and I will not abandon that practice now simply because the honest thing I have to report is one that no one wants to hear." The letter was never published. It was found among the papers of Marin's colleague after that man's death in 1974, passed to a nephew, and eventually donated to the Historical Society in 1989. Meanwhile, Blackmir Lake sat beneath its winter covering and gave nothing away, listening, requested a transfer to a different line in March of 1928, and left the region entirely. Theodore Voss continued to farm his dairy operation on the eastern edge of the county, and as noted, never spoke of the lake again. August Marin returned to Blackmir Lake on February 3, 1928, alone. He did not fish. He did not bring equipment. He drove his truck to the Northern Shore access point, walked out onto the ice to approximately the location where they had been set up on January 14th, and stood there for 1 hour. He recorded this visit in his journal with characteristic precision, noting the temperature, the wind direction, the condition of the ice surface, the quality of the light. He noted that the lake was entirely still. He noted that the water visible through a natural crack in the ice approximately 30 yards to his east was dark and unrevealing. He noted that he heard nothing unusual and observed nothing unusual during the full hour of his visit. And then, at the very end of the journal entry for that day, below all the careful measurements and neutral observations, he wrote 4 words that the Historical Society pamphlet printed in italics, perhaps sensing that they required some form of distinction from the clinical prose surrounding them. He wrote, "But it knew me."
There are places in this world that accumulate history, the way certain soils accumulate salt. Slowly, invisibly, in quantities that do not reveal themselves until the ground can no longer support what is planted in it. Blackmir Lake was such a place, and the winter of 1928 was not, as the people of Alcona County initially assumed, an isolated incident, a strange chapter that would close itself and allow life to resume its ordinary rhythm. It was, instead, a door that had been opened, and doors, once opened, do not close simply because the people standing in the doorway decide they would prefer to be somewhere else. The history of Blackmir Lake, excavated carefully from county records, church archives, Ojibwe oral histories, and the private papers of several families who had lived along its shores across multiple generations, reveals a pattern that is either deeply significant or deeply coincidental, depending entirely on what you are willing to consider possible. Deputy Howard Stills, to his considerable credit, had begun pulling on this thread even before his January 17th report was filed. He was a thorough man. He believed that the present is always in conversation with the past, and that understanding what has happened requires understanding what happened before. What he found, in the county records stretching back to the mid-1800s, was a series of incidents clustered around Blackmir Lake that no one had ever thought to arrange in sequence because no one had ever had a reason to look at them together. The earliest recorded incident dated to the winter of 1871. A trapper named Solomon Fitch, working the northern Michigan wilderness during a particularly brutal January, had filed a report with the Territorial Land Office, not a law enforcement report, but a formal complaint against persons unknown for what he described as interference with his trapping lines along the northern shore of the lake, then known by its Ojibwe name. The complaint was brief and practical in its opening paragraphs, as trappers' complaints tended to be, but in its final section, where Fitch was asked to describe the nature of the interference he had experienced, the language shifted in a way that the territorial clerk apparently found sufficiently unusual to underline in pencil, a mark still visible on the document when Stills examined it in late January 1928. Fitch wrote that his lines along the northern shore had not been disturbed by any animal he could identify. The disturbance came from beneath the ice, from beneath the water, from beneath the lake bed itself, he wrote, as though something below the floor of the world had reached up through every layer between itself and the surface and rearranged things according to a preference Fitch could not determine. He reported hearing a sound, a low, sustained tone that he felt more in his chest than heard with his ears. He reported that his dogs, 3 experienced working animals that he described as unshakable in the face of ordinary wilderness dangers, had refused to approach the shore and had eventually, over the course of 2 nights camped at that location, stopped eating entirely. Solomon Fitch abandoned his northern shore trap lines and did not return to that section of the lake. The next incident in Stills' assembled timeline was from 1889. A Methodist minister named Reverend Charles Polk had organized a winter retreat for a group of 12 congregants from his church in Harrisville, a gathering intended to combine the spiritual benefits of quiet natural surroundings with the practical pleasures of ice fishing. The retreat was documented in the church's administrative records, which Stills accessed through the current minister, a cooperative man who seemed genuinely disturbed by what the deputy was assembling. The retreat took place over 3 days in February of 1889 on the northern shore of Blackmir Lake. On the second day, the administrative record notes simply that the retreat was concluded early due to weather conditions and that all participants returned safely to Harrisville. But the church records also contained, in a separate folder, Reverend Polk's personal account of the retreat written for his own files,
a document that had apparently never been read by anyone who succeeded him in the ministry because it had been misfiled behind a collection of donation ledgers from the 1890s. Polk's account of the second day reads, in part, "We were gathered in prayer on the ice at approximately 2 in the afternoon, when the surface beneath us began to produce a vibration unlike anything I have experienced in my years of living in this northern climate. The ice did not crack, it resonated, as a bell resonated, and beneath the ice, in the dark water visible through our fishing holes, something moved that was not a fish, and was not a current, and was not any natural thing I am able to name from my knowledge of this world or my study of the next." 3 of my congregants wept without knowing why they were weeping. One man, a farmer named Gustav Reinhold, who had never to my knowledge expressed any religious sentiment beyond dutiful Sunday attendance, fell to his knees on the ice and began to speak in a language none of us recognized. When it was over, he had no memory of having done so. I have prayed extensively on this matter. I have reached no conclusion that I am willing to commit to paper beyond this one. There are presences in this world that exist outside the categories our theologies have prepared us for. I do not know if that should comfort us or terrify us. On the ice of Blackmir Lake on that February afternoon, it did neither. It simply was, and we were very small beside it. Reverend Polk left Harrisville in the autumn of 1889. The church records list his departure as voluntary resignation for personal reasons. Gustav Reinhold, the farmer who had spoken in the unknown language, died the following winter. His death was recorded as natural causes. His heart, the county physician noted, had simply stopped. He was 43 years old, and had been, by all accounts, in excellent health. Stills found 3 more incidents between 1889 and 1928. A surveying team in 1903 that abandoned their equipment on the northern shore and refused to return for it. A pair of brothers in 1912 who reported to their family that they had seen the ice of Blackmir Lake breathing, rising and falling in slow rhythmic waves like the chest of a sleeping animal on a clear, windless afternoon in January. And a single entry in the diary of a schoolgirl named Agnes Weller, dated February 7, 1921, that read only, "We went to the lake today. I will not write what I saw because I do not have words for it. I will only write that it looked at me. Not at us. At me. And I understood, in the moment it was looking at me, that it had been there for longer than I am able to imagine, and that it was not lonely, and that it was not waiting. It simply was, the way a mountain is present, the way the dark is present. And I walked home and I did not look back, and I have decided that I will never go to that lake again as long as I live." Agnes Weller kept her word. She lived until 1979, and the lake was never mentioned again in any document connected to her name. Howard Stills compiled all of this into a supplementary file that he attached to his January 17th report and marked in his careful handwriting as background context. He showed the file to Sheriff Abbots. Abbots read it in its entirety without speaking. When he finished, he set it down on his desk, looked out the window at the January street outside, and said, "What do you want to do with this, Howard?" Stills said, "I don't know yet." Abbott said, "Then let's wait and see if anything else happens." Something else happened.
The ice on Blackmir Lake broke on March 2, 1928. This was not unusual. The northern Michigan lake systems typically shed their winter covering sometime between late February and mid-March, depending on the severity of the season and the particular geography of each body of water. The ice does not go quietly. It cracks and groans and shifts in ways that carry for miles through the cold air, sounds that the longtime residents of the region have learned to read the way sailors read weather, as information, as signal, as the language of a landscape communicating the terms of its seasonal transition. Children growing up along the shores of these lakes learn early that the breaking of the ice is not a single event, but a process, sometimes lasting days, a slow negotiation between the frozen surface and the warming water beneath. The breaking of the ice on Blackmir Lake on March 2, 1928, was not like that. It happened between 2 and 3 in the morning, while the surrounding countryside was asleep. There were no witnesses on the lake itself, but there were witnesses to what they heard from the shore, and those witnesses, 3 separate households on the eastern and northern edges of the lake, each independently contacted the sheriff's office the following morning to report what they described as an explosion. Not a gradual cracking, not the extended, sequential groaning of ice releasing its grip on itself. An explosion, a single, massive, concussive event that shook windows in their frames, rattled dishes on shelves, and waked sleeping children who cried without knowing why. Deputy Stills drove out to the lake on the morning of March 3rd. What he found was documented in a brief addendum to his original report, written in the same careful hand, but with, he later told Sheriff Abbots, considerably more difficulty than anything he had written before. Because what the ice had left behind when it broke, not how it had broken, not the pattern of the fractures, not the debris field along the shore,
but one specific thing he found when he walked carefully along the northern shoreline was something he had no framework for. In the shallow water along the northern shore, in a section where the ice had retreated and left the lake bed visible through perhaps 2 feet of clear, cold, early March water, Stills found marks on the bottom of the lake. Not natural formations, not the random patterns of sedimentation or the trails of feeding fish or the impressions left by submerged logs. Marks, deliberate, geometric, arranged in a configuration that Stills, a man of limited formal education but considerable native intelligence, recognized immediately as intentional, as made, as the product of something that had organized its actions according to a plan. He did not photograph them. The sheriff's department did not own a camera at that time, and the county's single camera was a large format device owned by the newspaper, whose editor Stills had no desire to contact about this particular discovery. Instead, he did what August Marin had taught him to do, in a sense by example. He stood at the edge of the water for a long time and looked, and then he went back to his truck and wrote down what he had seen in as precise and detailed a language as he could manage. The marks covered an area of lake bed approximately 30 feet in diameter, centered on a point directly below where, based on his knowledge of the January incident, the 5 fishermen had been positioned when they saw what they saw. The individual marks were consistent in their diameters, roughly 18 inches long, 4 inches wide, pressed into the sediment to a depth Stills estimated at between 2 and 3 inches. They were arranged in concentric rings, each ring comprising a different number of marks, the innermost ring containing 7, the next containing 14, the next containing 21, and the outermost, partial ring, interrupted where the shallow water gave way to deeper sections he could not see into, containing what appeared to be 28. 7, 14, 21, 28. Stills was not a mathematician, but he recognized a sequence. He described the marks themselves as resembling, in their individual shape, something between a large hand pressing into soft earth and the impression left by a tool he had no name for, elongated, slightly curved at one end, with a secondary depression beside the main impression that he described as a companion mark, like a shadow pressed into the sediment alongside the primary shape. He noted that the edges of each mark were clean, not eroded, not softened by water movement, not blurred by the settling of disturbed sediment. Clean, as though they had been made recently, as though they had been made perhaps at approximately 2 in the morning on March 2, 1928, at the precise moment the ice above them detonated outward in a single concussive event that shook the windows of 3 farmhouses along the shore. Stills took the addendum home that night and showed it to his wife before he filed it. His wife, a practical woman named Dorothy who had grown up on the shores of a different northern Michigan lake, and who possessed by her husband's description better instincts than anyone he had ever met, read the addendum twice. Then she set it down on the kitchen table and said, "Howard, what are you going to do with this?" He said he was going to file it. She said, "And then?" He said he didn't know. She said, "You need to talk to someone who knows about old things, not old like county records, old like before county records." Howard Stills knew exactly who she meant. There was, in the small community of Harrisville and its surrounding townships, an elder of Ojibwe descent named Thomas Bijicki, who was at that time approximately 70 years old and who had lived his entire life in the northern Michigan region. Bijicki was known to the county's non-native population primarily as a craftsman. He made furniture of exceptional quality that was sold through a shop in town, but he was known within his own community as something considerably more than a craftsman. He was a keeper of knowledge, a man in whom the accumulated understanding of generations had been deliberately deposited, the way a family deposits its most valuable possessions in the care of its most trustworthy member. Stills had met Bijicki on 2 previous occasions, both involving minor legal matters that had touched tangentially on the native community. He had found the elder to be courteous, precise, and possessed of a quality of attention that reminded him actually of August Marin, that same sense of a mind that was always fully present, always genuinely engaged, never performing engagement as a social courtesy while actually thinking about something else. He drove to Bijicki's workshop on the morning of March 5th. He brought the full file, both the original report and the supplementary background context, and the addendum about the marks. He laid it on the workbench beside a half-finished chair and asked if Bijicki would read it. Bijicki read it slowly. He read it the way Stills had written it, with complete attention, without rushing, treating each page as though it deserved the full measure of his consideration. When he finished, he stacked the pages neatly and placed them back on the workbench. He picked up the tool he had set down when Stills arrived and turned it slowly in his hands without using it. Then he said, "You want to know what is in the lake?" Stills said yes. Bijicki said, "My grandfather's grandfather knew what is in the lake. His grandfather knew before him. This knowledge goes back further than I can trace it, which means it goes back further than memory can reach, and memory in my family reaches a very long way. What is in the lake has always been in the lake. It was there before the lake was a lake. It will be there after the lake is something else. It is not a creature.
It is not a spirit in the way your tradition uses that word. It is, and here Bijiki paused for a long time, long enough that Stills wondered if he had decided not to continue. It is a remainder, something left over from a time before this world had settled into its current arrangements, before things had agreed on what they were going to be. It exists in the place beneath the place, and occasionally, for reasons we have never fully understood, it becomes curious about what is above it. Stills asked, "Is it dangerous?" Bijiki looked at him for a moment with an expression that Stills later described as not unkind but entirely serious. He said, "It is not dangerous the way a wolf is dangerous, or the way a fire is dangerous. It is dangerous the way depth is dangerous, not because it wishes you harm, but because you were not built for it, and some of what it is tends to come back with those it has looked at." Stills asked what that meant. Bijiki set down his tool and said, "Ask the men it looked at. Watch them carefully over the next few years, then you will understand what I mean." Howard Stills drove back to the sheriff's office and sat at his desk for a long time without doing anything. Then he picked up his pen and began to watch.
Watching, as Howard Stills had committed himself to doing, turned out to be a quieter and more unsettling practice than he had anticipated. He had expected, perhaps, dramatic developments, the kind of changes in a person that announce themselves, sudden erratic behavior, visible deterioration, the sort of transformation that draws community attention and generates the kind of talk that finds its way to a deputy's ears through the ordinary channels of small-town information. He had expected, in other words, something he could document, something that would fit into the language of a report, something with edges. What he found instead had no edges. The changes in the 5 men who had been on Blackmir Lake on January 14, 1928, were of a different category entirely. They were subtle in the way that the shifting of tectonic plates is subtle, imperceptible on any given day, undeniable across sufficient time, and capable of producing, eventually, consequences entirely disproportionate to the gentleness with which they had proceeded. Stills began keeping a separate notebook, entirely personal, never intended for official filing, in which he recorded his observations of the 5 men across the months and years that followed the incident. This notebook was discovered by his daughter after his death in 1961, tucked inside a copy of a Michigan geological survey from 1930 that had been shelved in his home study. His daughter, a schoolteacher named Margaret, read it in its entirety, and then, uncertain what to do with it, placed it in a box with other family papers. It eventually came to rest, like so many documents connected to the events at Blackmir Lake, in the collection of the Alcona County Historical Society. The notebook's observations, arranged chronologically, constitute one of the most quietly disturbing records of human change that this story has to offer. Carl Hennessy, the railroad worker from Ohio who had run from the ice and transferred to a different line, was the easiest to lose track of. Stills had no official reason to maintain contact with him after his departure from the region, and Hennessy left no forwarding information beyond a general address in Cleveland. But in the autumn of 1928, a letter arrived at the Alcona County Sheriff's Office addressed to Deputy Stills personally, written in a hand that Stills recognized from the signature on Hennessy's original witness statement. The letter was 2 pages long. Stills copied its contents into his notebook. Hennessy wrote that he was well, that he had settled back into railroad work in Ohio without difficulty, that his life had resumed its ordinary shape in most respects. But he wrote that he was experiencing something he did not know how to name, and was writing to Stills because Stills was the only person he had ever told about the lake, and telling someone seemed suddenly important. He wrote that he was dreaming of water. Not Blackmir Lake specifically, not any water he recognized, just water, vast, dark, cold, and impossibly deep, and that in these dreams he was not afraid of the water, which was itself strange, because Carl Hennessy had been afraid of deep water his entire life, since nearly drowning in a river at age 9. In the dreams, the water felt familiar. It felt, he wrote, and then crossed out the word, and then wrote it again because he could not find a better one. It felt like home. He asked Stills if any of the others were dreaming. Stills, who had not yet thought to ask, made a note to do so. Raymond Duchamp was the most visibly changed of the 5 men in the immediate aftermath of the incident. He had been, before January 14th, a sociable and uncomplicated man. His brother Earl described him as someone who moved through the world without friction, who found satisfaction in simple and reliable pleasures, who had never, to Earl's knowledge, experienced anything resembling spiritual crisis or existential uncertainty. After January 14th, Raymond Duchamp became quiet. Not depressed, his family insisted, not withdrawn in a way that suggested suffering. Quiet in the way of a man who has been given a great deal to think about, and has decided to think about it thoroughly before speaking again. By March of 1928, Raymond had begun attending a different church. Not the Methodist congregation he had belonged to since childhood, but a smaller, older Catholic parish in a neighboring town, where he had no prior connections and knew no one. When Earl asked him why, Raymond said only that he needed a tradition with more room in it. Earl did not know what this meant. He recorded it in a letter to a cousin, and the cousin preserved the letter, and the letter found its way into the historical record the way almost everything connected to Blackmir Lake eventually did, through the patient accumulation of small documents that no one, at the time of their writing, imagined would ever matter to anyone beyond themselves. By 1930, Raymond Duchamp had begun spending significant portions of his free time at the library in Harrisville, researching subjects that the librarian, a meticulous woman named Helen Carr, noted with some puzzlement in her own records. He was reading, she observed, everything the library held on the subjects of deep ocean geology, Precambrian life forms, the geological history of the Great Lakes Basin, and, most puzzlingly, a narrow field of early 20th century theoretical physics concerned with the properties of space and time at extreme depths and pressures. Helen Carr, who prided herself on helping patrons find what they needed, had offered to assist him on several occasions. He thanked him politely and declined. He seemed, she later said, to already know what he was looking for. He simply had not yet found it. He never found it. Not in any library. But he kept looking until his death in 1947, by which point he had filled 14 personal notebooks with handwritten notes, diagrams, and observations that his family, lacking any framework for understanding them, donated to the Historical Society in the 1960s, along with the notebooks of their other family members who had, it turned out, also been writing things down. Theodore Voss, who had built his wall and committed to maintaining it, kept his commitment with extraordinary discipline. Stills visited him twice in 1928 on the pretext of follow-up questions for the official record. Both visits were cordial. Voss answered procedural questions about the day itself, arrival time, weather conditions, equipment used, with complete cooperation. He deflected anything that approached the substance of what he had seen with a practiced ease that Stills found both admirable and deeply sad. But Stills noticed something during the second visit that he recorded in his notebook with particular care. Voss's farmhouse sat on a rise that offered from its eastern windows a distant view of the tree line along Blackmir Lake shore. During Stills' second visit, conducted in the kitchen over coffee, Voss positioned himself consistently with his back to those windows. When Stills shifted his own position during the conversation, angling himself so that the windows entered his peripheral vision, he noticed that the tree line was clearly visible from where he sat, a thin, dark line on the horizon, unremarkable, simply trees. He glanced at it and then back at Voss. Voss's eyes, he noted, never once moved toward those windows during the entire visit. Not once. In an hour and a half of conversation, in a room with eastern windows offering a view that any farmer would habitually monitor for weather and light, Theodore Voss did not look east a single time. He had arranged his entire life, Stills understood then, so that he never had to look in the direction of the lake. Earl Duchamp's changes were the most practical in their expression, and therefore in some ways the most revealing. Earl was a foreman at a sawmill, a man whose identity was organized around competence, productivity, and the ability to assess a situation and make a sound decision. He did not lose these qualities after January 14th. If anything, his colleagues noted, he became more efficient, more focused, better at his work. But he also became, quietly and without explanation, a different kind of reader. The sawmill's other workers noticed that Earl began bringing books to work, not the adventure novels or farming almanacs that had been his previous reading material, but dense technical volumes on subjects like deep-sea geology, ancient history, and the geological formation of the Great Lakes Basin. He read them during lunch breaks with the focused attention of a man studying for an examination. When a younger worker asked him once what he was reading, Earl looked up, considered the question, and said, "I'm trying to understand how old actually is." And then there was August Marin. August Marin's changes were the most extensive, the most documented, and the most ultimately significant, because August Marin, unlike the others, chose to move toward what had happened rather than away from it. He had said on the ice that day that they needed to write things down. He meant it as an immediate practical instruction. He could not have known, standing on the frozen surface of Blackmir Lake in January of 1928, that he was actually describing the organizing principle of the remaining 23 years of his life. He began corresponding with scientists, historians, and scholars across the country, writing careful, factual letters that presented the events of January 14th without embellishment, and asked with genuine intellectual humility whether any of his correspondents could offer frameworks for understanding what he had observed. Most did not respond. Some responded with polite dismissal. A small number responded with genuine interest, and with these Marin developed extended correspondences that continued for years, generating hundreds of letters that collectively amount to one of the most sustained amateur investigations into unexplained natural phenomena that the northern Michigan region has ever produced. He never found an explanation that satisfied him. But he found, in the process of looking, something that Thomas Bezicki perhaps anticipated, and that Howard Stills, reading Marin's letters with increasing attention over the years, came gradually to understand. The looking itself had changed him. Not broken him, not haunted him in the conventional sense of that word, but expanded him in a direction that had no name, toward a depth that had no bottom. He was larger inside than he had been before January 14th, 1928, larger in a way that was sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes vertiginous, always irrevocable. He wrote in a letter to a colleague in 1939, 11 years after the event on the ice, "I have come to believe that what we encountered that day was not an anomaly. It was a reminder.
a reminder that this world is built on something older than the world, and that the older thing occasionally shifts in its sleep, and when it does, those of us near enough to feel the movement are permanently altered by the knowledge that there is a sleep happening at all. I do not find this terrifying anymore. I find it, most days, humbling. On some days I find it beautiful. On the days when I find it neither, I simply find it true. And truth, I have always believed, is worth whatever it costs. Howard Stills read that letter in 1939, and wrote in his notebook beside a copy of the relevant passage. He is right, but I am glad it was him and not me.
The summer of 1932 brought a drought to northern Michigan that cracked the earth and turned the region's smaller streams into dry channels of pale stone. Blackmir Lake did not shrink. This was noted by several people and recorded in several places, with varying degrees of significance attached to the observation. The County Agricultural Extension Office noted it in a drought impact assessment as a minor hydrological anomaly, suggesting that the lake's unusually deep basin and its suspected connection to underground water sources likely explained its resistance to the regional water deficit. A farmer named Otto Schreiber, whose property bordered the lake's western shore, wrote about it in a letter to his brother in Detroit with considerably less scientific detachment. He wrote, "Every other lake and pond within 20 miles of here is showing its bottom. Blackmir looks exactly the same as it always does. Exactly. Not an inch lower, not a shade lighter. Like whatever feeds it doesn't care about drought. Like whatever feeds it doesn't care about anything up here at all." Otto Schreiber's letter is interesting for reasons beyond its observation about the water level. It is interesting because Otto Schreiber had not been on the ice on January 14, 1928. He had no direct connection to the incident. He was simply a farmer who had lived beside the lake his entire life, and who had, over the course of that life, developed the particular attentiveness that proximity to a body of water tends to cultivate in thoughtful people, a sensitivity to its moods, its rhythms, its deviations from expected behavior. He had not seen what the 5 fishermen saw, but he had felt, across the decades of his association with the lake, something that he had never fully articulated to anyone, because it had never seemed to require articulation. It was simply part of living beside Blackmir Lake. The drought of 1932 caused him, for the first time, to try to put it into words. He wrote in the same letter, "I have lived on this lake for 51 years. My father lived here before me, and his father before him. I have always known, in the way you know things that you cannot explain knowing, that the lake is not what it appears to be. Not dangerous, not malevolent. I want to be careful here because I do not want my brother to think I have lost my mind in the heat, but the lake has always felt, to me, like a place where two things occupy the same space. The lake that I can see, the water, the ice, the fish, the birds, the ordinary, beautiful northern Michigan lake that it appears to be, and something else. Something underneath the lake that uses the lake the way a hand uses the lake. I have never seen the hand. I have only felt, occasionally, its movement." He folded the letter, sealed it, and sent it to his brother in Detroit. His brother, a practical man who worked in the automobile industry and had no patience for what he privately considered Otto's tendency toward rural mysticism, read the letter, wrote back a brief and affectionate reply that did not address any of its more unusual content, and placed it in a drawer. When his brother died in 1958, the letter was among his effects. His daughter, sorting through the drawer, read it and kept it. She was, by coincidence or not, a woman who had spent several years working as a researcher for a small press that published regional history. She recognized the letter as potentially significant and eventually brought it to the attention of the Alcona County Historical Society. By the time it arrived there, it joined a collection that had been quietly growing for decades. The Historical Society had become, without entirely intending to, the repository for everything connected to Blackmir Lake, not because anyone had made a deliberate decision to focus on the lake, but because the lake kept generating material. Documents, letters, journal entries, official reports, a steady, slow accumulation of paper that represented the attempts of dozens of ordinary people across more than a century to process their encounters with something they could not explain through the available tools of language and record-keeping. The Society's director in the late 1950s, a retired schoolteacher named Ruth Engel, who had taken the position expecting to spend her time cataloging pioneer homestead records and church founding documents, found herself instead presiding over what she described in a letter to a colleague as the most peculiar archive I have ever encountered, not because any single document in it is extraordinary, but because of what they become when you read them together. Separately,
Each one is the account of an ordinary person having an unusual experience. Together, they are something else entirely. Together, they are evidence of something I am not sure I have the courage to name. Ruth Engel named it anyway, in a private journal she kept during her years at the Historical Society. She named it with the directness of a woman who had spent 40 years teaching children to be honest about what they saw, a sustained encounter between a human community and a non-human presence that has occupied the same geographic location for a duration that exceeds any human framework for measuring time. She then wrote on the next line, "I believe this is what happened. I believe it is still happening. I believe the lake is still there, and the thing beneath it is still there, and the only reason we are not more alarmed by this is that most of us have decided, collectively and without discussion, that it is easier not to think about it." Ruth Engel was director of the Alcona County Historical Society from 1957 to 1971. During those 14 years, she assembled the Blackmir Lake collection into a coherent archive for the first time, cross-referencing documents, establishing chronologies, and writing detailed finding aids that allowed subsequent researchers to navigate the material without losing themselves in it. She also, in 1962, authorized the publication of the regional history pamphlet that brought August Marin's journal entries and Howard Still's reports to the attention of the small but serious readership of Northern Michigan historical publications. The pamphlet generated more response than any previous publication in the Society's history. Most of the responses came from academics, historians, geologists, anthropologists, who were interested primarily in the documentary record itself, the question of how an ordinary rural community had processed and preserved an unusual collective experience across multiple generations. A smaller number of responses came from people who wrote not as scholars but as individuals with their own stories to tell, their own encounters with Blackmir Lake to add to the record. Ruth Engel answered every letter personally. One response in particular occupied her attention for months. It came from a man named Dr. Walter Fenn, a retired professor of geology from Michigan State University, who had spent 30 years studying the geological formation of the Great Lakes Basin. Dr. Fenn was, by his own description, a rigorous empiricist who had spent his career insisting on the primacy of physical evidence. He was also, by the evidence of his letter, a man who had been sitting with a piece of personal experience for 23 years, waiting for a context in which to place it. In the summer of 1939, Dr. Fenn had conducted a solo geological survey of the Blackmir Lake Basin as part of a broader study of northern Michigan lake formations. He had taken core samples from the lake bed at multiple locations, working from a small boat equipped with a basic coring device. The samples from most locations were consistent with what his geological knowledge predicted, layers of sediment representing the accumulated deposit of centuries, readable as a record of the lake's history in the way that tree rings are readable as a record of a tree's life. The samples from the northern section of the lake were not consistent. At a depth of approximately 40 feet below the lake bed, below the level of sediment, below the level of the geological strata he expected to encounter, in a layer that by his calculation represented material laid down before the formation of the Great Lakes Basin itself, before the glaciers that carved the modern landscape of northern Michigan had arrived or departed, his coring device encountered something that was not geological. He could not identify it. He had sent samples to 3 colleagues at other institutions, describing them only as anomalous material from a northern Michigan core sample without specifying the location. All 3 colleagues had responded with variations of the same assessment. The material was organic in origin, appeared to be structured rather than random in its composition, and did not correspond to any known biological or geological classification. One colleague, a paleontologist at the University of Chicago, had added a handwritten note at the bottom of his assessment that read, "Walter, where did you get this? I need to know where you got this." Dr. Fenn had not told him. He had placed the samples in storage in his university office, where they remained for 23 years until his retirement, at which point he had taken them home and placed them in his basement, uncertain what else to do with them. He had not published his findings. He had not discussed them with anyone. He had, like Theodore Voss before him, built a wall, though his wall was constructed not from deliberate avoidance, but from the particular paralysis of a scientist who has found something that his science cannot accommodate, and does not know how to proceed without either falsifying his findings or destroying his professional credibility. Reading the 1962 pamphlet had, he wrote to Ruth Engel, broken something loose in him that had been stuck for over 2 decades. He wrote, "I have spent 23 years trying to decide whether what I found in that core sample was more dangerous to acknowledge or to suppress. Reading your pamphlet, reading the accounts of those men on the ice and the deputy and the others, I have finally understood that this question was always the wrong question. The right question is simply, what is true? And what is true is that something exists beneath Blackmir Lake that is older than the lake, older than the geological formation surrounding it, older than any biological classification system my field has developed, and structured, deliberately, purposefully structured, in a way that implies not mere existence but intention." He asked Ruth Engel if she would like to see the samples.
She wrote back the same day she received her letter. She said, "Yes, immediately, please."
Ruth Engel drove to Dr. Walter Fenn's home in East Lansing on a Thursday morning in October of 1962. She had told no one where she was going, not because she believed secrecy was necessary, but because she had learned, across 5 years of assembling the Blackmir Lake archive, that certain conversations were easier to have before they became public knowledge. Once other people knew about a thing, the thing acquired a social dimension that complicated the simple act of looking at it clearly. She wanted to look clearly first. She could share afterward. She had spent 40 years as a schoolteacher practicing exactly this discipline. See the thing accurately before you describe it to anyone else, because your description will shape how others see it, and that responsibility requires you to be certain your own vision is unobstructed. Dr. Fenn met her at the door of a modest brick house on a quiet street lined with maple trees that had gone fully golden in the October air. He was 71 years old, lean and precise in his movements, with the hands of a man who had spent decades doing careful physical work, the hands of a scientist who had always believed that knowledge lived in the material world and must be extracted from it directly, not inferred from a distance. He shook her hand with a firmness that communicated respect, led her through a hallway lined with geological survey maps, and down a set of wooden stairs into a basement that smelled of old paper and mineral dust. The samples were in a metal cabinet against the far wall. He had maintained them, she noted immediately, with extraordinary care. They were stored in sealed glass cylinders, each labeled in his precise handwriting with date, location coordinates, and depth. There were 11 cylinders in total, representing core samples taken at different points across the northern section of Blackmir Lake's basin. 9 of the 11 contained material that looked to Ruth Engel's untrained eye like ordinary dark sediment, compressed layers of organic and mineral matter, the accumulated record of centuries. The 10th contained a layer of lighter material approximately 2 inches thick that Fenn identified as glacial till from the period of the last ice age. The 11th cylinder was different. It was the same diameter as the others, the same height, sealed with the same careful attention, but its contents were not the same. The material inside was not the dark anonymity of sediment or the pale gray of glacial till. It was, in a way that Ruth Engel found immediately and profoundly difficult to process, almost iridescent, not brightly, not in the way of a peacock feather or an oil slick, those familiar surfaces that play with light in ways the eye finds pleasurable. In a way that was subtler and more unsettling, as though the material absorbed light and returned it slightly altered, as though it took in what fell on it and gave back something adjacent but not identical. She stood in front of the cabinet for a long time without speaking. Fenn stood beside her with his hands in his pockets and said nothing, giving her whatever time she needed. He had waited 23 years. He could wait another few minutes. Finally, she said, "How deep was this?" He said, "Below 40 feet of lakebed sediment, in a layer that by any standard geological calculation should contain nothing but Precambrian bedrock. Material that was laid down, conservatively, 600 million years ago, before complex life existed on this planet in any form that our biology recognizes." She said, "And your colleagues who examined it?" He said, "Called it organic, structured, unknown." One of them used the word purposeful. He was a careful scientist and he used that word deliberately, and then he never mentioned it again in any publication or correspondence as far as I have been able to determine. She said, "What do you think it is?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think it is evidence of something that was here before here was here, before this landscape existed, before this continent existed in its current form. I think whatever is in Blackmir Lake, whatever those men saw rising through the ice in 1928, whatever has been leaving its impressions on the record of this region for as long as humans have been present to notice, I think it is not a resident of this lake. The lake is simply the place where its presence intersects most directly with the surface, where the distance between whatever depth it actually occupies and the world we can see is smallest. The lake is a window, not its home." Ruth Engel looked at the iridescent cylinder for another long moment. Then she said, "May I take this back to the Historical Society?" He said, "I was hoping you would ask." She drove back to Harrisville with the cylinder wrapped carefully in a cloth in a wooden box on the passenger seat beside her, and she thought about windows the entire way. The cylinder joined the Blackmir Lake archive in a locked cabinet that Ruth Engel had installed in the Historical Society's back room, specifically for material she considered too significant and too fragile for general access. Over the following month, she wrote to Dr. Fenn regularly, and their correspondence became, across the remaining years of both their lives, one of the most intellectually rich exchanges in the archive. A retired schoolteacher and a retired geologist, each bringing their own discipline's tools to a question that neither discipline was equipped to answer alone, finding in the gap between their frameworks a space where something closer to truth could be approached if not quite reached. In the spring of 1963, something happened that neither of them had anticipated. A journalist contacted the Historical Society. His name was Paul Merritt, and he worked for a regional magazine based in Detroit that published long-form articles on Michigan history and culture. He had read the 1962 pamphlet. It had reached him through a circuitous route involving a university library, a colleague's recommendation, and what he described as 3 successive nights of being unable to put it down, and he wanted to write a feature article about the Blackmir Lake incidents. He was, by the evidence of his initial letter, a serious journalist. He was not interested in sensationalism. He was interested, he wrote, in the human story, in what it meant for a community to live beside something it could not explain, to pass that unexplained thing down through generations, to preserve it in documents and letters and whispered conversations, while simultaneously maintaining the ordinary business of farming and fishing and raising children and going to church. Ruth Engel met with him twice before deciding to give him access to the archive. The first meeting was a general conversation in which she assessed his seriousness. The second was a more specific conversation in which she explained to him, with the directness of a woman who had spent her career being honest with young people, exactly what she expected from him and what she would not tolerate. She would not tolerate sensationalism. She would not tolerate the mockery of the individuals whose documents were in the archive, people who had taken serious risks, personal and professional and social, by recording what they had experienced. She would not tolerate the reduction of a complex and genuinely mysterious phenomenon to the vocabulary of cheap entertainment. Merritt agreed to all of her conditions without hesitation. He spent 3 weeks in Harrisville that summer, reading through the archive with the same focused attention that Ruth Engel had brought to it 5 years earlier. He read Still's reports, Marin's journals, Raymond Duchamp's notebooks, and Dr. Fenn's geological assessments, and the letters of Otto Schreiber and Agnes Weller, and the 17 responses to the Harrisville Courier, and all the rest of it. He took careful notes. He was quiet and courteous, and asked good questions, and never once, in Ruth Engel's observation, reached for an easy explanation when a harder and more honest one was available. He also, with Ruth Engel's permission, drove out to Blackmir Lake. He went alone, on a clear July afternoon when the lake was blue and still and entirely, deceptively, ordinary in its summer presentation. He parked at the northern shore access point, the same point where Howard Stills had parked in March of 1928, where August Marin had parked on his solitary return visit in February, and walked down to the water's edge and stood there for a long time. He later wrote in a letter to Ruth Engel after returning to Detroit, "I stood at the edge of that lake for perhaps an hour. It was a beautiful afternoon. The water was clear and calm. 2 loons were fishing about 100 yards offshore. Everything about the scene was peaceful and ordinary, and entirely northern Michigan in the best possible sense of that phrase. And yet I could not shake for the entire hour I stood there, the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something that extended in a direction I had no name for. Not deep exactly, not far. Those words imply dimensions, I understand. This was a different direction entirely, and the feeling was not frightening. It was, and I keep returning to this word because no other one fits, it was vertiginous. The way standing at the edge of a great height is vertiginous. Not because you are in danger, but because you are suddenly, viscerally aware of how much space exists in a direction you do not normally look." He asked her in the same letter, "Do you think it is still there?" She wrote back, "I think it has always been there. I think always, in this context, means something larger than the word usually contains." Paul Merritt's article was published in the autumn of 1963. It ran to 11,000 words and was titled, with a restraint that Ruth Engel particularly appreciated, "What Lies Beneath Blackmir." It won a regional journalism award the following year. It generated more letters to the magazine than any previous article in its history. It was reprinted twice, and it ensured that the events of January 14, 1928, and everything that preceded and followed them, would never again be entirely forgotten. August Marin had died in 1951, 10 years before the pamphlet, 12 years before the article. He had spent the last 2 decades of his life in the sustained and patient investigation he had committed himself to on the ice, finding no final answer, accumulating instead an understanding that had no conclusion, but was itself, he had written in his final journal entry 3 weeks before his death, more valuable than any conclusion could have been. He wrote, "I began this inquiry because I saw something I could not explain, and I believe that unexplained things deserve explanation. I ended having learned that some things are not unexplained because we lack the intelligence to explain them, but because explanation is not the appropriate relationship to have with them. The appropriate relationship is something older and simpler and more honest than explanation. It is attention, pure, sustained, humble attention. I have given this thing my attention for 23 years. I believe it has given me something in return, though I could not tell you what. I am larger than I was. I am less certain than I was. I am, I think, more true than I was. This seems on balance sufficient." Howard Stills read this journal entry after Marin's death. He copied it into his personal notebook without comment. Below the copy text he drew a single horizontal line and wrote nothing else on that page.
The lake does not give up its dead. This is not a metaphor. It is a documented fact, noted in county records across more than a century of Blackmir Lake's recorded history, that bodies of individuals who drowned in its waters were recovered with unusual difficulty, or, in several cases, not recovered at all. The lake's unusual depth
Its basin drops to over 230 feet at its deepest recorded point, an extraordinary depth for an inland Michigan lake of its size, provided a partial explanation that satisfied the county's official documentation requirements. Deep cold water, particularly water that maintains unusually low temperatures year-round, as Blackmir consistently does, can create conditions that prevent the natural processes that typically return drowned bodies to the surface. Partial explanations, as everyone connected to Blackmir Lake had learned, were the best the official record could offer. There had been 7 drowning deaths recorded at Blackmir Lake between 1871 and 1962. Of those 7, 3 bodies were recovered within expected timeframes and in expected conditions. 2 were recovered after unusually extended delays, 1 after 11 days, 1 after 23. And in both cases the recovery location was the northern section of the lake, far from where the drownings had occurred. The remaining 2 bodies were never recovered at all. The first unrecovered body was a young man named Frederick Haas, age 19, who drowned in August of 1903 during a swimming excursion with friends. His companions reported that he had been swimming strongly and without apparent distress when he simply stopped being visible on the surface. No struggle, no cry, simply present and then absent, with no transition between the 2 states that anyone on shore could identify. The water at the location was estimated at 60 feet deep. Dragging operations over 3 days retrieved nothing. Frederick Haas was never found. The second unrecovered body presents a more complicated case. In September of 1941, a woman named Iris Caldwell, age 34, went missing from the eastern shore of Blackmir Lake under circumstances that were never fully resolved. She had been staying at a small summer cottage belonging to her family, alone for a week while her husband remained in Flint for work. On the 5th day of her stay, her husband arrived unexpectedly to surprise her and found the cottage empty, her personal belongings undisturbed, a cup of coffee on the kitchen table that was still faintly warm. The cottage door was unlocked. Her car was in the yard. A search of the shoreline revealed a single set of footprints in the soft earth at the water's edge, terminating at the lake's margin without turning back. The prints were consistent with Iris Caldwell's shoe size. They led directly into the water and did not return to shore. Howard Stills, still serving as a deputy in 1941, was part of the search team. He noted in his personal notebook that the footprints showed no evidence of running, no evidence of stumbling, no evidence of any disruption in the ordinary rhythm of walking. They were the prints of a person who had walked to the water's edge and continued walking. Not fallen, not jumped, walked, with the same unhurried, even pace that characterized every step between the cottage door and the lake. Iris Caldwell's body was never recovered. Her husband, a quiet man named Robert Caldwell, who bore the ambiguity of his wife's disappearance with a dignity that those who knew him described as almost unbearable to witness, spent the remaining 30 years of his life cycling through grief and determination in the way of a man who has been denied the closure that a body provides. He hired private investigators twice. He consulted with the state police. He returned to the cottage every summer for a decade, walking the shoreline, watching the water, waiting for something to surface. Nothing surfaced. In 1955, Robert Caldwell wrote a letter to the Alcona County Sheriff's Office, not to report new information, but to ask a question that the letter makes clear he had been carrying for 14 years. He asked whether the Sheriff's Department had any documentation of unusual incidents at Blackmir Lake prior to his wife's disappearance. He asked this carefully, framing it as a general inquiry into the lake's history, but the letter's final paragraph revealed what he was actually asking. He wrote, "I have spent 14 years trying to understand why my wife walked into that lake. She was not a despondent woman. She was not troubled, not in any way I was aware of, and I knew her well. She was happy that week. She had told me so on the telephone the evening before she disappeared. She liked the lake. She had spent summers on it since childhood. I am not asking for an explanation because I believe one exists in any ordinary sense. I am asking because I need to know whether other people have felt what I believe she may have felt standing at that water's edge, that pull, that invitation. I need to know whether I am the only one who suspects that she did not fall in and did not jump in, but walked in because something in that water asked her to, and because whatever was asking spoke in a language she could not resist." Sheriff Leonard Abbots, who was still in office in 1955, read the letter and forwarded it to Howard Stills, who by then had retired, but who remained, in Abbott's understanding, the department's institutional memory on the subject of Blackmir Lake. Stills read the letter at his kitchen table and sat with it for a long time. Then he wrote a reply to Robert Caldwell that was 3 pages long, the longest personal letter he had written in years. He told Caldwell about the 5 fishermen, about August Moren's journal, about Thomas Bashiki's explanation of what the Ojibwe tradition understood to be in the lake, about the marks on the lake bed, about the pattern of incidents stretching back to 1871. He told him everything that was in the file,
everything that was in his personal notebook, everything he had been carrying for 27 years. He also told him something that was not in any file or notebook, something he had never written down because he had never been able to find language precise enough to carry it without distortion. He told Caldwell that in his 30 years of observing the effects of Blackmir Lake on the people who encountered it, he had noticed a pattern that went beyond the documented changes in the 5 fishermen, and the geological findings, and the historical incidents. He had noticed that the lake seemed to respond to a particular quality in people. Not courage exactly, not intelligence, something more specific and harder to name. An openness, perhaps. A permeability. A quality of being genuinely available to experience rather than defended against it. The people who were most profoundly affected by the lake, Moran, Raymond Duchamp, Agnes Weller with her diary entry, Dr. Fenn with his core samples, were not the bravest or the most analytical, they were the most genuinely present, the most honestly, vulnerably open to what the world actually contained, rather than what they had decided in advance it should contain. He wrote to Caldwell, "I do not know whether this is a comfort or not. I suspect it is not in any conventional sense. But I have come to believe after 30 years of thinking about this, that what is in Blackmir Lake is not indifferent to human beings. It does not see us the way we see bacteria, as irrelevant life forms too small to register. It notices us, specifically the ones among us who are most fully alive to the actual texture of existence. Whether what it does with that noticing is something we should call invitation, or call consumption, or call something else entirely for which we do not yet have a word, that I cannot tell you. I am sorry that I cannot tell you more than this. I am sorry that it is not enough. I am sorry about your wife." Robert Caldwell wrote back once. His reply was 4 sentences long. He wrote, "Thank you for telling me. I had suspected most of it. The part I had not suspected, that it notices us, that part I will carry differently than the rest. I find, to my surprise, that it helps." He died in 1963, the same year Paul Merritt's article was published. He never returned to the cottage after writing to Stills, but his family reported that in his final years he had seemed, despite everything, at peace with something. They did not know what. They knew only that whatever it was, it had to do with the lake, and that he had stopped fighting it, and that the stopping had freed him in some way they could see but not explain. Howard Stills died in 1961, 2 years before Caldwell, a year before the Historical Society pamphlet that would bring everything he had spent 3 decades quietly assembling into its first public light. He left his personal notebook to Ruth Engel in a brief handwritten addendum to his will, with a note that said only, "For the archive. She will know what to do with it." She did. The notebook joined the collection in the locked cabinet in the back room, beside Dr. Fenn's iridescent cylinder, and the transcribed journals of Auguste Morin, and the 14 notebooks of Raymond Duchamp, and all the rest of the accumulated testimony of a community that had lived, for nearly a century, beside something it could not name, and had chosen, with varying degrees of courage and resistance and wonder, to bear witness to it anyway. The lake, through all of it, remained. Blue in summer, gray in autumn, white under its winter covering, dark at its core at every season, in every light, at every hour of the day or night. A darkness that was not the absence of light, but the presence of something that light had not yet reached, and might never reach, and perhaps was not meant to. Still there, still deep, still, occasionally, rising.
There is a particular kind of courage that history does not celebrate, because it does not look like courage from the outside. It does not involve battlefields or burning buildings or the split-second decision to step between danger and an innocent person. It involves instead the slower and quieter, and in many ways more demanding choice to remain honest in the presence of something that rewards dishonesty with comfort. To keep looking at a thing that would be easier to stop looking at. To write it down when writing it down costs you something. To tell the truth about what you saw when the truth is the kind that makes the people around you take a small, imperceptible step backward, reassessing you, recalibrating their confidence in your reliability, filing you quietly in a different category than the one you occupied before you opened your mouth. Auguste Morin made this choice on January 14, 1928, standing on the ice of Blackmir Lake with his hands shaking too badly to write, and he kept making it every day for the remaining 23 years of his life. Howard Stills made it when he wrote in an official county document that no probable explanation presented itself, knowing that his supervisor would read those words and that they would follow him professionally. Thomas Bezishiki made it when he told a county deputy the truth about what his people had always known, understanding that the truth would be received with the particular condescension that the dominant culture reserved for indigenous knowledge, not quite disbelief, which would at least have been a form of engagement,
but the more dismissive response of being listened to politely and then filed away as folklore. Ruth Engel made it when she locked a cylinder of unidentifiable organic material in a cabinet in the back room of a small historical society and committed herself to understanding what it meant rather than pretending it was something she recognized. These were not dramatic acts. They were the acts of ordinary people choosing, in ordinary moments, the harder of two available responses to an extraordinary thing. And it is because of those choices, because of the courage that does not look like courage, that we are able to sit here, nearly a century later, and know what happened on Blackmir Lake on January 14, 1928. Or rather, know that something happened, know the shape of the knowing without knowing the thing itself. Because that is the final and perhaps most important truth about the events recorded in this story. We do not know what rose from beneath the ice of Blackmir Lake on that January morning. We do not know what Thomas Bezishiki's ancestors knew about it, not fully, because that knowledge lives in a tradition that was not designed to be translated into the language of county reports and geological surveys. We do not know what the marks on the lake bed meant, or whether the iridescent material in Dr. Fenn's cylinder was a part of it or a product of it, or something else entirely. We do not know why it looked at August Marin and why he felt that it knew him. We do not know why Iris Caldwell walked into the wire on a September morning in 1941 and did not come back. We know that something is there. We know that it has always been there, in the sense that always means longer than we can follow with any instrument available to us. We know that it occupies a depth that is not purely geographical, not simply the 230 feet of recorded water above a lake bed, but some further depth that the lake provides access to without fully containing. We know that it rises occasionally for reasons that remain their own, and when it does, the people near enough to witness the rising are permanently altered by the knowledge of what they have witnessed, not broken, not destroyed, expanded, in the direction that has no name, toward the depth that has no bottom, into a larger and less comfortable and more truthful versions of themselves.
We know that August Marin stood on the ice and watched when others ran or knelt or froze, and that watching cost him something and gave him something, and that 23 years later, 3 weeks before his death, he judged the exchange to have been worth it. We know that Howard Stills spent 30 years watching 5 men change in ways that confirmed everything Thomas Bezicki had told him, and that he left his notebook to Ruth Engel because he understood that the watching mattered and that someone needed to continue it. We know that Robert Caldwell found, in the knowledge that the lake had noticed his wife, that her openness and her aliveness had made her visible to something ancient and incomprehensible and real, a peace that had eluded him for 14 years of not knowing. And we know, because the documents tell us, because the letters and journals and reports and notebooks tell us, with a consistency that spans generations and disciplines and personal histories so varied they should not converge, but do. We know that whatever is in Blackmir Lake is not gone, has never been gone, will not be gone in any time frame that is meaningful to us. The lake is still there. You can find it on a map. Alcona County, northern Michigan, 11 miles long, cradled between pine forests and limestone ridges, 230 feet at its deepest recorded point, cold year-round, unusually, inexplicably resistant to drought, blue in summer, gray in autumn, white in winter, dark at its core in every season. The Northern Shore access point still exists. There is a gravel turnout where you can park, a path through the trees to the water's edge. In winter, the ice forms thick enough to walk on, 18, 19 inches in a hard January, solid enough to hold the weight of a truck, solid enough to hold 5 men and their equipment, and the ordinary expectations of an ordinary fishing morning. Solid enough until it isn't. The Alcona County Historical Society still holds the archive. The documents are there. The reports, the journals, the letters, the notebooks, the geological assessments, the sealed cylinder in the locked cabinet in the back room. They are available to researchers. They have been available for decades.
They sit in their folders and their boxes in the careful order that Ruth Engel gave them, waiting, as documents always wait, for the next person willing to read them with full attention and honest eyes. There is no resolution to offer you. This is not a story with a resolution. The cases that have resolutions, the mysteries that close, the questions that find their answers, the disappearances that are finally explained, those are satisfying in a particular way that this story is not and cannot be. What this story offers instead is something that the people at the center of it spent their lives learning to value above resolution. It offers the truth of the open question, the integrity of saying, "This happened, and we do not know what it means, and we are going to tell you about it anyway, because the telling matters more than the explaining." August Marin knew this. He wrote, in the last pages of his journal, in handwriting that his advancing age had made slightly unsteady but no less precise, "I have been asked by several people over the years whether I regret having been on that lake on that January morning, whether I wish I had stayed home, whether the knowledge I have spent 23 years living with has made my life better or worse than it would otherwise have been. I understand why people ask this. It seems like a reasonable question. It is not, actually, a reasonable question. It is the question of someone who believes that knowledge is optional, that you can choose what to know and what not to know, and that the choosing is straightforward. It is not straightforward. Some knowledge finds you whether you seek it or not. Some mornings you drive out onto the ice with your fishing equipment and your ordinary expectations, and the world shows you something that rearranges everything, and there is no version of that morning in which you do not see it. You can close your eyes, but you cannot unsee. You can stop talking about it, but you cannot unknow. What you can do, what I have tried to do, is carry it honestly. Look at it directly. Let it make you larger. Let it make you less certain and more true. This seems to me the only dignified response available to a person who has been given, without asking for it, a glimpse of how deep the world actually goes. Let it make you larger. Let it make you less certain and more true. 5 men drove onto the ice of Blackmir Lake on the morning of January 14, 1928, with 2 trucks and their equipment, and the ordinary intentions of a winter fishing day. What rose from beneath that ice in the hour before noon on that cold, clear morning has no name in any language that has been written down. It rose with intention and paused with what August Marin recognized, standing 2 feet away from it on 19 inches of frozen water, as the quality of a decision being made. And then it descended, not because it was finished, but because it chose to be. It is still there, below the dark water, below the lake bed, below the Precambrian bedrock, in the layer that has no geological name because it predates the formation of the world that geology was developed to describe, in the depth that goes in a direction we have no word for, toward a place we were not built to reach. It is still there, and occasionally, in the deep midwinter, when the ice is thick enough and the world above is quiet enough, and the distance between its depth and our surface is at its smallest, it becomes curious about what is above it. It rises, and if you are on the ice when it does, if you are one of the ones it decides to look at, one of the ones whose openness and aliveness make you visible to something that has been present since before visibility had a meaning, you will feel it before you see it. A tone in your chest that is not quite sound, a change in the water that is not quite movement, the ice beneath your feet flexing like a membrane, like the thin skin between 2 worlds that have agreed, for the length of one cold January morning, to acknowledge each other. And you will understand, in that moment, what August Marin understood standing on the ice in 1928, what Thomas Bajiki's ancestors understood standing on the shore in times before memory can reach, what every person who has ever looked honestly at Blackmir Lake has understood, to whatever degree their courage allowed them to receive it, that we are not alone in this world, that we have never been alone, that the company we keep is older than we can imagine, and deeper than we can follow, and present in ways that our instruments cannot measure, and our language cannot contain, and that it knows we are here. It has always known. Before we built our towns along its shores, before we named its water and surveyed its basin, and drilled our holes through its winter ice, and sat above it with our lines in the dark water waiting for something to rise, it knew we were here. And it has been watching us, patiently, from its impossible depth, with something that is not curiosity exactly, and not hunger exactly, and not love exactly, but contains within it something of each of those things, the way deep water contains the memory of every surface it once was. Watching, waiting, rising when it chooses, and returning when it decides. This has been Liturgy of Whispers. If this story reached something in you, if you felt, at any point during this narration, that particular vertigo of standing at the edge of something that goes further than you can see, then you already understand what August Marin spent 23 years trying to put into words.
Leave it in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me whether the lights are on or off. Tell me whether you looked toward the nearest window when you heard about the ice. Tell me whatever you feel moved to tell. Because the telling matters. And because this community, every one of you listening in the dark, is its own kind of archive, its own kind of record, its own kind of proof that the things we cannot explain are worth the full measure of our attention. Subscribe to Liturgy of Whispers if you have not already. There are more stories in the dark where this one came from. Stories that found their way to this channel because they refused to be forgotten. Because the people at their center chose honesty over comfort, and documentation over silence, and the open question over the false resolution. They are waiting for you, as they have always been waiting. In the depth that has no name. In the direction that has no word. In the dark that is not empty.